Welcome to Drinking on the Edge. I'm its host, David Fuhr. Joining me here in the Radio Free Rhinecliff studio in New York it's one of its producers, Jen Hammoud. Once again, we have co-host Carlo DeVito. So on this lovely late summer day, joining us here in studio is a local fella. Stephen Osborne's the proprietor, distiller, winemaker, dishwasher.
Everything.
Of Stout Ridge Distillery and Winery and Vineyard across the river in Marlborough. Welcome, Stephen.
Oh, thank you. Good to be here.
And joining us across the ether, across the country, different locations in Frederick, Maryland, no less, is Monica Pierce, who is the proprietor and distiller at her 10th Ward Distilling. Welcome, Monica.
Thank you.
From New Orleans, Louisiana, a fellow I've had the pleasure of spending a bit of time with the latter half of last year in a more rum-soaked capacity. But today he's here to talk otherwise. It's Jed Haas of Atelier V Distilling.
Hello, everyone.
And clear across the country from the left coast in Alameda, California, from St. George Spirits, Mr. Dave Smith, who's here with us today via Zoom.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on.
We have 4 distillers here. What are they going to be talking about? Something that Carlo and I are mutually novice, and that is absinthe. Now, everybody's heard of absinthe. Not so many people have tasted it. It's a very particular sort of spirit, particular sort of concoction, and it lends itself well, as far as I could see, to the nature of craftsmanship. In many ways, more than, in some ways different, at least different, but more than a great many other spirits, for reasons you'll hear shortly. But Carlo and I have agreed that here today, our 4 guests, since they know a hell of a lot more than we do about absinthe, we're going to allow them to converse and just chat about the history of absinthe, what it means, its origins, talk about how we got here today.
Here's one thing. The French, they invented absinthe. The Swiss say it's their thing. Now, if we go back to the late 1700s, there was this guy by the name of Ordinaire, Dr. Ordinaire, who was a Frenchman living in Switzerland. He is reputed to have made the first commercial absinthe, which is still available to this day. It's called Ordinaire. When you see those bottles, it is a bit of a puzzle. Like, oh, it's just ordinary absinthe? I thought it was supposed to be special.
I think all absinthe is special at some level. It should be, but I think that comes not from the history of absinthe, but from the expression of this as a creative endeavor, as a way to create something new, a future, if you will, through a spirit.
The history of absinthe also includes a lot of really cool creative stories and artistic connections, but what you probably hear more about when you're hearing and learning about absinthe are the myths associated with absinthe. And those of us that make absinthe have heard it all from every customer under the sun. But that's always a fun thing to get into. Absinthe had a lot of propaganda associated with it back in the day. Some say it was the wine industry in Europe was worried about competition, and so they made a bad rep for absinthe. Some say artists and musicians were smoking opium at the same time, so they were all a little nutso when they were drinking absinthe. It really is just a high proof spirit that is traditionally high proof but delicious, and if you're not paying attention to how much you're drinking, you're really just going to get really drunk off of it, and you're not going to hallucinate. You're not going to have an experience. But I will say it's funny, any of the rookie customers that you communicate with, you'll get anything from their college buddy brought a special bottle back from Czech that's nothing like the American version of absinthe, which can't be legal, to then they all had some experience in their basement with it, and really, they probably, like I said, just all got themselves really drunk. You can always expand on all those things. Go ahead, Dave.
I think it's a great perspective. And one of the things I'd want to point out is 2 thoughts here. One, if basically people are imbibing, I think if they're choosing to drink tequila or absinthe, or let's say they're drinking Sauvignon Blanc or whatever it is that day, I think they bring some expectation to that. And I think that definitely feeds into this. And absinthe has such an amazing breadth of history and a relationship to the Bohemian culture that I think it was unfairly vilified during the temperance movement. And if you look at how you've got phylloxera, you have French wine production is damaged deeply. And at that time, absinthe was on a rise. You have it's a drink of poets and writers of the lowest class of society to some degree in that. And what happens is you end up with wine sale, basically wine with the U.S. fruit stock Phylloxera is managed back in France. There's wine availability again. Wine sales are not coming back up as quickly as one would hope. And you've got the temperance movement happening around the world. In places like the US, we actually outlaw alcohol together. In other places where I think alcohol has a much more mature aspect to its culture, in France is a perfect example of this. They choose a single spirit to say alcohol is not bad, but this particular spirit is bad. And look at the people who are drinking it, and we're going to outlaw this spirit on its own. And that lasted, and that sort of affected everything. The absinthe was slowly re-legalized around Europe and eventually in the US here into the early 2000s.
I was going to say, here in the U.S., it was outlawed. Am I correct? 1912, I think, was around the time that it was outlawed here.
So it's prohibition predated that of alcohol itself, it sounds like, if that's or even close to that. So if perhaps you can talk a little bit about the ingredients that go in generally into absinthe, and because everybody makes their own version, of course, otherwise it wouldn't be a craft.
So I think of fennel seed as the base of it, and I use anise as a backup to it. But I try to build all my flavor profile around the Xanthium and the fennel seed.
How about three of you on Zoom? What's your weighing on that?
The three key ingredients that has been mentioned now: wormwood, anise, fennel. All that the absinthe trinity. The way I look at it is the proportions of each and how much you use, along with other ingredients, all go into creating flavor profile. In the case of my hats, I have one that's heavy on the wormwood, one that's heavy on the anise, and one that's heavy on the fennel. I also grow some wormwood at the distillery and use that as part of the mix, a couple of them. And that is a very interesting addition to the recipe.
And how about
when you're thinking about your blend of those three, what he called the Holy Trinity, anise, fennel, and wormwood, you're also thinking about not just your flavor profile, but what we call the la louche, what you want to get, that creamy effect that you get when you dilute your absinthe with ice water. Anise and fennel particularly are rich and high in oils and fats. And so finding the right blend, we even use a mix of anise seed and powdered anise, fennel seed and powdered fennel, a mix of a few items to be able to get that perfect louche. And as you probably learned when you set wormwood in vodka, that is a bittering agent. And so you also have to be careful about your use of wormwood, both in your digestion phase and in your coloration phase, which we can also get into technically if you guys are curious about that. But for us, it's finding that happy medium of how your herbs are going to interact with your production process and how you're developing your recipe, the creamy mouthfeel that you want to get from your absinthe once it is almost chemically changing as you drink it, which is pretty cool.
I think it's a really good point, Monica, and it's something where I love to hear that you're using both the powdered and whole ingredients because you're looking at essentially surface area and extraction and having a sense of that. And even, Jed, even that idea of being able to have actually, here's the terroir of our absinthe, in part influenced by wormwood that's grown at the distillery. Because all of that does really make a difference. It impacts the thumbprint of that spirit. For us, we start with a base of white wine brandy, and we infuse whole star anise, fennel seed, and wormwood. And that's to everyone's point. That's the trinity. That's the basis of absinthe. You need to have all three of those components together to sort of form that base.
Dave, you just touched on something that I wanted to ask about, which is what's the difference between, I'm very familiar with making vodka and gin and whiskeys. What's the difference between making those and making an absinthe? How is it different?
But how much time do you have? What I want to say is that whiskey, just real broad strokes here, whiskey always comes from a grain. And that could be corn, rye. It could be made in Scotland for Scotch and be a single malt or blended. You could have a bourbon that's a majority corn mash. There's rules that go into it about the aging and all of that. Brandy will always come from a fruit. Rum will always come from a sugarcane fried product, molasses, something like that. Vodka is interesting because it's actually defined by the process, not by the raw material. Vodka has to hit 95%, so 190 proof plus during the distillation process. So if we took brandy and distilled it to 160 proof, we made brandy. If we took that brandy and we distilled it all the way up to 96% alcohol, we've made vodka. And so that's the difference there. And the other thing that I'd want to point out about absinthe, and I think everyone could really contribute to this idea, But absinthe is a really special spirit because it's not a singular note. Its very basis is 3 unique ingredients, and there's a balancing act. And then I'm sure everyone here has got other ingredients that they're using to expand on and play with that Venn diagram of character. And so you're trying to make something that's actually beautifully complex in that space. And absinthe is defined by having wormwood in there, and then it traditionally has star anise and fennel as well. I don't believe that it technically, for U.S. standards, has to have those, but I don't think I've ever seen one that doesn't have those. And if someone please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Steve,
Yeah,
what do you use for your base?
Yeah, so I use grape brandy, and I use grape rectified spirit as well. So I have 190 proof grape spirit. I have everything between off the still at 145 to off the still at 193. So I use a variety of different bases depending on what I'm trying to achieve with the absinthe. So I actually play around a lot with the base, partly because I'm a winemaker and I make brandies, and so I have all sorts of brandies in the house, and I have a rectification column, so I can play around with the base spirit a lot. Also, I think one thing I'd like to add to the conversation here that's been happening is an important thing to know about absinthe is they're made at very high proof, not just gratuitously. They're made at high proof because you're trying to dissolve a lot of the oils that are coming out of the herbs, and the flavors are in the oils. And so with absinthe, we're trying to achieve a very high flavor content, a very high oils content, partly for the louche that we've been talking about. So a big difference between a regular spirit and absinthe is they're made at high proof, and it's not just for fun. It's because we're trying to make a very impressive flavor profile. And to do that, you need the alcohol. I'm an artist as well, and so I think of on painting, I use light to enhance color in painting, and as a distiller, I use alcohol to enhance flavor. So that's a thing about absinthe is the high alcohol content can be thought of as a very bright light on flavor. And so that, in addition, makes absinthe a particularly tricky thing because you have these 3 ingredients that you're trying to get to play well together, and you've got a very bright light. And so it's a lot of fun.
That answers my question I had lined up about the relatively high ABV compared to other spirits. Provided that no one disagrees here on Zoom, that I'll leave that as the selling point for the high ABV in absinthe. But I also have it Stephen dropped in my ear in our recent communications that you are going to be making an absinthe made out of plums you've just distilled. Is that correct?
Yeah, we had a bumper crop of plums this year, and so I'm going to be making an absinthe with a plum brandy base.
Well, I look forward to seeing how that turns out.
A sliv of its absinthe.
I was just trying to figure out what's the name of something like that, the slivovitz and absinthe. That sounds...
Sliv absinthe.
Yeah, I was just saying, Steve, we're going to workshop the name on this, but let me know how I can buy some of that. I'm fascinated by that idea.
I think we need some absinthe to help get those brain wheels rolling to consider what to do. And Carlo has cracked the first cork. It is Monica's 10th Ward. Was this a Nouvelle?
Nouvelle.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He's poured me a small taste. Monica, you want to run us through what you've created here?
Sure. So our absinthe, when we talk about base spirit, we did used to use a blend of an apple brandy and a cane neutral spirit, which is just a sugarcane base distilled up to a high enough proof where it's essentially flavorless. With the growth of our business and the amount of wholesaling we've been doing, we determined to keep just the cane neutral spirit base and focus more on the herbal flavor and blend, because we felt like that was the most economical, but also more important for us. Our particular spirit otherwise has, as we mentioned, your standard anise, fennel, and wormwood in it. We do a mix of anise seed, anise powder, fennel seed, fennel powder, and star anise. During that phase, the distillation, the digestion phase, which is when you're almost soaking your kettle like how you steep a tea before you boil it to the point where you're distilling it. We also include chrysanthemum and mace in that recipe. And then what you're going to do, and hopefully this is okay that I'm teaching you guys a technical way to distill absinthe, is after that has steeped for a certain amount of time, 12 to 24 hours, maybe longer, depending on who's doing what, then you're going to do a very long with your herbs because you don't want to scorch them in the kettle. We leave our herbs in the kettle while we're distilling and distill it almost to the point where we have nothing left in it without burning the bottom. And then once that's finished, we go through what is called a coloration phase. So the spirit that we keep from the distillation, we pump back into the still. We color our absinthe with petite wormwood. So we use a grand wormwood during digestion, petite wormwood during coloration. We also use lemon balm, hyssop, and bergamot. And the reason we call it Absinthe Nouvelle is just because we add some more untraditional herbs and items in there to just serve as our sort of modern version of an absinthe.
Yeah, it's very beautiful, by the way. I just want to say, it's a beautiful absinthe.
It's a really pretty, both straight up and there's a lovely louche here. It's lovely.
Louche.
Beautiful texture.
And that's another thing I could explain a little bit when you're talking about high proof spirit. There's chemistry happening there because the alcohol is bonded to the fats when it's in a higher ABV, but alcohol and water actually like each other more than alcohol and oils do. So as you're adding, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, technically, as you're adding the water, it's bonding to the alcohol and it's pushing out the bond from the fats. And that's what creates that really cool, creamy louche. And what's fun about that is when you're looking at tasting notes of a spirit, absinthe almost has a whole other section of profile that you can teach people about, which involves mouthfeel, color. If it's opalescent, if it's barely even see-through, you can add these different characteristics throughout different processes of how you're drinking your absinthe. And that's what makes it so much more complex and unique and fun to teach people about. So there's my long explanation on Absinthe Nouvelle.
I have a quick question for you. When you're serving this, because you do a lot of entertaining, etc., how do you serve it just as with water, or do you have cocktails that you are making with your absinthe?
We do both. So we offer traditional fountain service to our guests. They can choose to add sugar or not. We don't do the crazy light show with the fire and all of that because it's actually unsafe when you're around high-proof spirit.
Especially at a distillery.
Although I get it, it brings in the customers if you're going for that. And then, yes, we have a beautiful cocktail bar and tasting room. So right now we have a watermelon absinthe frap on for our summer menu, which will soon be changing. But that's always a fun one, a fun component, and an all Maryland Sazerac with our Maryland rye.
I was going to say you must be doing a Sazerac for sure. Okay.
Absolutely.
It was fantastic.
Right there.
Yeah, I guess worth mentioning Sazerac Cocktails created at the old Absinthe House bar on Bourbon Street. Was where, I guess, the cocktail was.
Let me correct that.
Oh, go ahead.
There you go.
Jump in, Nola.
Okay, yes. Created by Antoine Anthony Peychaud, his pharmacy, quarter. Although the old Absinthe House has been around for quite a while.
I enjoyed myself there back in December. I had a good late night with Miguel. And my deep studies on Wikipedia told me that the place had once been frequented by no less a Hudson Valley icon than FDR himself. So there's a shout out to the Hudson Valley through one of our dead presidents.
Can I ask a technical question on that absinthe? I didn't hear you in your description of the distillation. Do you go into the tails a little bit with that and bring some oil back in? Or is that just a straight hearts?
For my absinthe?
No, for the one we
I think
just
that's for
tasted.
Monica.
That would be a question.
I think that's Monica.
So we try to, while it's a very long and slower distillation than normal, just because you want to extract as much of the oils as possible, we do the tails as much of it as we can, and then you keep it for your next batch. And because, why am I just blanking on the word for it? Dave, you might know when you're adding the white stuff back, the phlegm. I just forgot that word for a second. It's another word for tails of absinthe that has more of richness and oils in that. So yes, we do save that for the next batch.
Yeah, I was just wondering because the louche on it was indicative of that method.
It's been a few years. As pre-pandemic, I last visited Frederick, but I had a fantastic time at your distillery there in central Frederick, located and easy to get to. And I wasn't on the weekend, so maybe the parking was just too fantastic, but maybe the weekends are tougher. Jed, we're going to roll into your absinthe trio next. Since we got 3 to taste, what should we start with?
Probably with the red. The red is sometimes called the gateway absinthe for new absinteurs. It's heavier on the anise, so it's more on the sweeter side, on the liquorish side. Now, I would like to address something that was touched on earlier.
Oh, but may I ask you, just to be sure, you
just to touch on something that was mentioned earlier regarding sugar and fire. Those are both things that I do not recommend and try to discourage. Definitely do not add any sugar. Please don't light your absinthe on fire. So you would be advised to add some water to it. Generally 3 to 5 parts of water is a good starting point, although some people prefer more and some people prefer less. So the red goes back quite a ways, years ago, and there's a long history of absinthe in New Orleans going back to the 18th. There was a number of French distilleries that were sending absinthe to New Orleans. So it was consumed quite a bit, especially at the old Absinthe House that was mentioned a moment ago. And so I thought about bringing absinthe back, starting the first distillery in New Orleans to make absinthe since who knows when, rather than just saying, okay, we'll just make the same old thing. We had the idea of making red absinthe, a little bit different. I call a new school American absinthe. And so we have this, as I said, the heavier note underneath on that, more on the sweeter side, and it's colored red with hibiscus, which gives it a bit of an interesting tangy note.
Sorry if I can just ask the question. How's the color stability with that red?
It definitely does not last forever. Because the hibiscus is a natural ingredient, it does break down over time. And that is one of the reasons we put the absinthe in black bottles. We have some opaque black bottles.
It makes good sense, and I just want to go put it out there. I think everyone on the call on the show would agree with me, but it's just I applaud things that don't last forever and look like basically petroleum product. This green absinthe is reactor fluid. It's like the fact that it comes from it's organic material and it is going to change some over time, and that's actually the beauty of it, is that sense of that evolution.
And you can definitely see absinthe on the shelf that you can tell are artificially colored.
This most certainly is not, and as someone who used to enjoy a lot of hibiscus tea in his day, yes, if you leave a cup sitting out, the color will rapidly dissipate. It's absolutely true for hibiscus.
It's a beautifully subtle absinthe. It's very nice, a very interior kind of a subtlety. It's beautiful.
Which color next?
I would go with green. The green is what I would call more of the classic absinthe flavor profile. As I was working on the green, simultaneously started this whole project of growing wormwood. I wasn't certain I was going to use the homegrown wormwood in the absinthe or not. And because that took so long, I initially started developing it without it. And the recipe was okay, but I wasn't really satisfied with it. Then eventually I got the first batch of locally grown wormwood. Did a run with that. It was a big difference there. There's the magic ingredients. That's the key differentiation with the loose green, is that it does use this wormwood that grow at the distillery.
So far, this is the most restrained, subtle series of aromas that I'm picking up on the absinthe. See if it holds it throughout, but this is more restrained aromatically than any other I've smelled so far.
Yeah, the absinthium has a less aggressive aromatics, but you'll get it on the flavor. It's coming through strong.
Oh yeah. Oh boy. It's already done.
This absinthe has that bitterness on the back of the tongue, lovely astringency. As a winemaker, I can say that I really appreciate a little astringency in the back of the absinthe coming from the wormwood. Very nice.
Very pretty.
It's a different swing to the balance, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess last is the white.
And what is the dominant thing on the blue?
So the blue, it's heavier on the fennel, and this one actually, development process goes back almost 10 years. I originally had developed it as a blanche absinthe. Now, back in the day when absinthe was banned in Europe, Swiss moonshiners realized that if they did not color their absinthe green, it would be somewhat undetectable as to what it was. And the Swiss tradition of blanche absinthe developed. And so I had this blanche recipe, but I wasn't quite satisfied with it. Earlier this year, I started thinking about it again. I started thinking about ways to make it more distinctive. Now, sometimes these Swiss blanche absinthes are sometimes called blues because they're said to have a little bit of a tinge of blue to them. So I thought, why don't we just make it blue? So we've added a little bit of a blue color to this absinthe. As I mentioned, heavier on fennel, and there are also a few what I'll call non-traditional absinthe ingredients in this one as well.
I tend to think of this as a little bit more savory for some reason.
Yeah, the fennel seed has a more complex flavor profile, and it brings out floral notes. You get all sorts of beauty. Now, there's other ingredients you might have put in that are bringing those out as well.
Right.
But I think you can really see the reason that I like fennel so much is this idea that it blooms out into this complexity. So it's beautiful. Yeah, it's
really
nice.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Three completely different absinthes.
Yeah.
Really amazing.
Well done.
Oh, I'm really loving the finish on this blue, and thank you for allowing me the misstep of calling it white, because I guess you called it white once before. So there we go. It is blue. And side note, a lot of white clothing to make it extra white, believe it or not, has a special blue dye added to it.
There you go.
And so there's something to that. I'm sure there's people who are involved in optical sciences who can share more of us as to why that is, but it's a thing I found out. Let's see. We should move onwards to St. George. Worth mentioning, and Dave almost said it earlier on, he vaguely alluded to it, but that St. George Spirits was the first U.S. distillery to create an absinthe for commercial purposes once the repeal was done. I believe it was 2007. Is that correct, Dave?
December 21st, 2007 is when we released it, but I'm not very good with dates. I remember the day really well. And what I'd want to say is that our master distiller, Lance Winters, started making absinthe almost a decade before that, just as an exploration, long before it was ever considered legal again in the US. And I think there's an important point. We talked a little bit about the history of absinthe in that sense of being outlawed. What's a weird point here is that absinthe itself wasn't outlawed in the US. The word absinthe was outlawed on a label. So you could use these ingredients. You could use wormwood in a spirit. And in fact, it's a common flavoring agent in something like vermouth. It's a common bittering agent. Vermouth comes from the German vermouth. So you could use wormwood, which is considered the signature ingredient of absinthe. You could use it in a spirit or a wine, as it were, but you couldn't actually put the word absinthe on a label. And it took a Swiss absinthe company, a white absinthe company, Kubler, about 5 years working with the Tax and Trade Bureau to get absinthe considered re-legalized. And then a French company, Lucid, was the first to market. I think Kubler just couldn't get it all pulled together once they had actually effectively changed the laws in the States, so the interpretation of the law. And then so Kubler was second to market, and then we were the first commercially produced absinthe in America post-prohibition on December 21st, 2007. We opened our doors. We didn't know if anyone would show up. And we had a line that stretched around the building. And for those of you who don't know us, we're in this we're on an old retired naval air station. Right now, I'm looking at my office. I can see a view of the San Francisco skyline and the Bay Bridge in front of us. It's this old retired naval air station. And we got this old 65,000 square foot aircraft hangar from the World War II era. And we had this line wrapping around the building. We had helicopters flying overhead. We had a woman showed up that day and said, "Can I buy 2 bottles of absinthe?" And I said, "Yeah, you can buy 2 bottles of absinthe." And she's, "Oh, thank God." So I called in sick to work today to be in line to buy absinthe, but my boss just called me because he saw me on TV and he asked if I could buy him a bottle.
That's a good boss.
So our absinthe was a project, an internal love project, just friends and family for a decade before absinthe was re-legalized. And eventually, when we did the final version of it for when we put to bottle, is this composed of that basically grape brandy, along with star anise fennel and wormwood, so large wormwood, and we're distilling that all together. We take that white absinthe, that absinthe blanche, and we infuse that with both dry as well as fresh ingredients. And so I've got stinging nettles, lemon balm, hyssop, opal basil, mint, and finally fresh tarragon as well. And all the color that's there, all of that comes from that secondary infusion with those botanical ingredients. And it helps to shape and play with that sense of a Venn diagram where absinthe has this beautiful, for us at least, that fennel and star anise, almost a woodsy sort of sarsaparilla kind of quality. You're trying to balance out these really lovely, dried, bitter, grassy tones to it. And it build on that as a base concept.
The lemon balm does come through to me, and being in the Bay Area, which I know intimately, having lived there for 12 years of my life, and being a forager, do y'all forage your own nettles and lemon balm? I mean, the area is replete with it.
We don't. At this point, we do some foraging for some ingredients in our gins with like fresh bay laurel here in the Bay Area. That's for our backyards, things like Douglas fir in our terroir gin. We're foraging that as part of fire clearing efforts on private land here in about 120 miles of the distillery. There's a lot of things that we do forage, but we don't forage that, particularly those ingredients.
It's all right.
Is there?
Talk about, sorry, I was going to step in really quick. I'm not sure about the production capacity, Dave, that you guys have, but as much as we'd love to even have some of our ingredients locally grown, the amount that now we're producing just to fulfill demand, I don't have a nearby farm that could grow enough of what we would need without having to source some of our botanicals. They're still from great herb suppliers, but I don't think we'd be able to keep up with it.
Monica, why don't you care enough to risk everything to start a farm as well as a distillery to have a second or third business? This is a really good observation, because it's one of those areas where St. George Spirits were founded in 1982 by a gentleman named Jörg Ruf, and German. It's an eau de vie distillery. So unaged fruit brandies. There's essentially your act as a distiller is to be a caretaker for these raw materials, this agricultural products, pears, cherries, raspberries, and take a sensory snapshot of the harvest. And that's really important, because the quality of raw materials that you choose directly impacts the spirits that you make. You can't hide flaws. You can't basically get cheap raw materials and make beautiful spirits. It just doesn't work. And then when you look at that from an absinthe maker, you have to have that. For us, it's our mindset. It's who we are. It's our point of view at St. George Spirits. To basically, you've got to source really great raw materials. And that means you're either foraging them yourself, or you're working directly with farmers, or you're working directly with brokers, and you're going through different versions of those particular ingredients, and you're being really careful and methodical in choice. We do a coffee liqueur that involves doing coffee cuppings annually, because we only get coffee beans from Ethiopia. And so we've got to choose our harvest, and we've got to make a commitment to it. And then hopefully there's sales for it, or worst case scenario, we just drink it all ourselves. And you know what? That's not the greatest loss.
You rang one of my bells there. Ethiopian source coffee is some of my favorite in the world.
I have a question on this. Was hyssop one of the coloring ingredients in this that was a fresh ingredient?
No, the hyssop's actually dried.
Is it?
So the dried ingredients are the stinging nettles, the lemon balm, and the hyssop.
Yeah.
And
but
then
your coloring is heavily on the hyssop on this, no, or not?
Along with the stinging nettles and the lemon balm, they're all definitely present there. The fresh ingredients are the opal basil, the tarragon, and the mint. And I got to tell you, there's about a week of the color of that infusion. It is like bright, vibrant jade. It is the most gorgeous thing in the world. And then it starts to come down and basically just darken a little bit over time. And frankly, what I also really love about this, though, is that little bit of that oxidation, it really showcases beautifully. I feel like this gets a bit more of a sarsaparilla woodsy note to it.
Yeah, you did say that.
It's
got a certain gentle palate.
Yeah, it does. It has a very gentle, lovely palate.
Yeah, it caught me off guard there for a second. It's a soft, almost more elegant style, I found. And a quick shot back to Judd there. We were talking about farming botanicals. It must be you doing yeoman's work there deep in New Orleans, farming your own wormwood. To you, congratulations.
Quite a lot of work, and I do have a couple other growers. One other grower who's growing some for me as well, and I'm always trying to add some more to have some backup crops.
Fantastic.
Fun story about wormwood. I'll just share. Doing a still of absinthe, and you've got wormwood. My wife will always know when we've been making absinthe. I'll come home and give her a kiss, and she's immediately just like spitting and saying, "Oh, so bitter! You made absinthe today, didn't you?" It's very potent.
From our Zooming guests to our in-studio guests, we are now moving to the absinthes of Stoutridge and Stephen Osborne. First one's poured. Stephen, why don't you walk us through this?
So this is my Blanche. It's made on a wooden still. So I was experimenting with copper still, small copper still, and then I was tinning the copper still to see if I could lower the destructive nature of the copper on the flavorings, and that seemed to work well. And then I thought, as long as we're lowering electronegativity, why don't we go to wood and see what that does? And so it came off the wood still. I thought, this is it. So wooden stills are very nice because they aren't altering the flavors that you're putting in the beginning. You don't get a loss of flavor during the distillation. The output is, I make about 3 cases of this at a time. So that's the problem with wooden stills, is that if you can't make them very big, or if you lose control, it's a big problem there. That way. So it's wooden still. Also, the brandy on this, like I said, there's some brandies that are made from high proof, but there's also some brandies that are made from a lower proof off the still brandy. So the absinthe has a fair amount of brandy character. So when you smell this, what you're smelling that's really different from what the other guys were tasting is you get this brandy note. You get this sort of eau de vie brandy.
Eau de vie, that's what I get as the eau de vie, yeah.
And then if you also look at the louche on this, it's very opalescent. I work very hard on getting an opalescence to the louche. I really like the thing.
Oh, it really does. Look at that.
Yeah. So I'm big on that visual element.
Harkening to your painter comments, there you go.
And then one thing that's different here too is because I have a fair amount of brandy note in this absinthe, that I I have to work the flavors around that brandy note, which is why I use a lot less anise and a lot more fiddle seed, is because it has a flavor profile that's more conducive to the complexity of that brandy. And I think also there's almost like a sweetness that you get from the brandy. There's no sugar in this, but it has this sort of a little bit of a sweeter kind of a quality. I like the base spirit coming out a little bit, but that's because
I think that comes out that way. Yeah, it's lovely.
It's all locally grown grapes. The grapes were grown within 10 miles of the winery, and our winemaking method is completely natural. We use no alteration to the chemistry in winemaking, no finding agents, no sulfites, nothing. And it's all gravity fed. Everything's gravity fed. The winery is gravity fed, so no pumps, no filters in the wine, which may sound it may sound crazy, but it does make a big difference in the brandy. And the brandy base of this also, the part that was the lower proof is double distilled on a directly fired still. So you do get flavor generation from that furnace. There's a 2,500 degrees underneath the still, and it will create flavors in the spirit. So that's what's going on with the Blanche.
Which one is next?
So the next we could do the Vert. So you want to pour it?
Oh, okay.
You got to take it.
Yeah. Okay.
As Carlo takes
So
care of it.
on the Vert, I'm basically taking the Blanche, except the one thing that I do different is I use more of a rectified spirit. I don't want as much of a brandy note coming through on the Vert. And then I'm primarily using Petite Absinthe to flavor Pontica. I love Pontica. It took me a long time to find good Pontica, but once I found it, it's great. So the Petite Wormwood is the major coloring ingredient. I make eight different kinds of absinthe, and this one is the only one I have that's the sort of the very strong on the Pontica note. So the Petite Wormwood. But the base is fairly similar. It's just more of a rectified spirit, less of a brandy-ish spirit. And I'm sorry you guys on the other end can't taste these.
I was gonna write a Yelp review about this and how I haven't been able to taste it. Just fury.
Yeah, you didn't ask us to ship 4 bottles so that everybody got.
Wow, this is a completely different kind of nose.
Yeah, you get almost a smokiness on the nose.
Oh, yeah. Most definitely. And whereas the first one was a good entry level, shall we say, style, soft, this one's a bit more pronounced, wants to be noticed.
And what's the base spirit on this?
It's rectified grape spirits. There is a little bit of brandy like in the previous one, but it's mostly 193 proof off our column still. We have a 30 plate Carl still to get really nice clean spirit.
And as long as Steven's mentioned, he's dropped the still that he's using, why don't you all take a moment to give your technical apparatus a shout out?
That's a very personal question for comment.
Well intended.
So I'll start at St. George Spirits. We've been working with Arnold Holstein for the last 42 years. They're a German still manufacturer out of Markdorf, the German-Swiss border, and they're eau de vie style stills. We also have car head assemblies, so those are vapor infusion baskets for some work there as well. We have a number of still pots here ranging in a lab size down all the way down to 2.5 gallons, all the way up to about 390 gallons, so 1,500 liter stills at the largest end of the spectrum.
And Monica, what are you pulling the levers on?
Yeah, the still that we make our absinthe on is a 1,000 liter hybrid pot and column still made by Still Dragon. They're based out of Florida here in the US. We wanted something that was versatile and affordable. That was the very first still that we started with. And it was great for the fact that we were making gin, whiskey, absinthe, etc. So that's the still that we continue to make our absinthe on. That still is named Falcor, inspired by a great story because it was made by Still Dragon. And then Mama Bear is our big mama still. That's our whiskey still. So that's a 2,000 liter pot still manufactured by Specific Mechanical out of British Columbia. And that has much more copper than stainless steel in it. The hybrid still is more stainless steel, where the copper still is designed primarily for temperature conduction, specifically to get the best flavor that we can out of our whiskeys. And that one was named because grizzly bears are prominent in the British Columbia area.
Certainly not in Maryland these days. And lastly, Jed.
Yes, we have a 30-gallon still. Still boiler was made by a company that's actually a predecessor, Still Dragon, and the rest of the still was built locally. It's all electric, and they built a control panel.
You said you a little bit more clearly, please. Did you say you built the control panel yourself?
Correct.
Jed, is that all electric? So it's a water bath or
No, it's direct fire.
it's direct fire? Interesting. Okay.
Just as a note there to something that was mentioned earlier, after I'm doing the infusion of the herbs for our absinthe, we infuse outside the still using a separate infusion system and strain out the liquid and just use the liquid for the distillation. Move the herbs prior to the distillation. Is how we're able to do it using direct immersion heaters.
Thank you for that, Jed. And back to the third absinthe we're tasting here with Stephen.
Yeah, so the third absinthe is one that I call Absinthe Vishuddha. And Vishuddha is the throat chakra and yogic Ayurvedic medicine. And all that I've done is that not the Trinity, but other herbs that are typically used in absinthe have Ayurvedic origins. And so one day I was thinking, why not emphasize certain Ayurvedic herbs that are already in the absinthe and then align them to these yogic chakras, just as a kind of a fun thing to do. And so people could have their chakra aligned absinthe as a fun thing. And it worked out really well. So this is the Vishuddha chakra, and it's emphasized spearmint and chamomile.
I was going to say the chamomile comes through, and I think it's got almost like a soothing effect on this.
Yeah,
absinthe.
Vishuddha is throat chakra, and we're still using those herbs to soothe our throat now, mint and chamomile.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Technically, this counts as a health drink now, right?
Oh my! You actually said that.
I feel better.
Fortunately, you're not on. You're off time now, right? So you're not speaking as a distiller.
A distiller's time is always on time.
And the opalescent louche that Stephen had alluded to for his first absinthe carries through to the other two. Just
Yeah, they're really pretty on that side. These are three lovely and completely different absinthes, really fabulous. I'm going to get to something that we talked about before the show began, and I feel like we've left it out here because I think there's so many misconceptions about it with the Thujones. And if you can, if someone can explain to me, because I've had so many people say to me, oh, well, Americans don't make real absinthe. It doesn't have any Thujones or doesn't have enough. Can someone take that conversation on?
Absolutely. So thujone is a heavy compound which is in the wormwood, but is generally left behind by distillation. Now, up until recently, you were required to send in a sample of your absinthe to the TTB, and they would test it and certify it as being thujone-free or not, which they defined in their very lengthy ruling from 2007 as being 10 parts per million or less. And in that ruling, they say that if they ever come up with a more sensitive test, they reserve the right to set a new standard. Apparently, their machine only goes down to 10 parts per million. But in the recent changes to distilled spirits labeling that went into effect in 2000, they removed the requirement that you actually have to send in your absinthe sample. I guess they've given up on that whole thing and recognized that thujone content is not really a big concern. Thujone is a psychoactive compound, but it's psychoactive in the same way that caffeine is psychoactive. And you'd have to use about as much thujone as you would caffeine in order to kill yourself, which would be hundreds of gallons. Furthermore, alcohol has a prophylactic effect, so that if you have some alcohol while you're consuming your thujone, you're even safer.
And just I'll jump out there for a minute and say thujone, I think it's FDA. The FDA describes it. It's not even a psychoactive. It's actually it's like a convulsant. And as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of better ways to recreationally convulse than absinthe.
I believe I don't know if this is true or not, but I think that it is. I believe that we're limited to 30 parts per million by the FDA as becoming dangerous just from the compound. But any absinthe that was 30 parts per million, I don't know we'd really be drinking it. It would be pretty bitter.
And I'll say also from just seeing a chemical analysis and pre-prohibition absinthe, even the stuff from that era, that none of that was getting anywhere near that threshold.
Yeah, it wouldn't be good. It just wouldn't be good.
Yeah.
Although our listenership happens to be worldwide, so I'm told, I would think that a large percentage of it is based here in New York. And just to be clear, even though for sure Stephen Osborne's Stout Ridge products are available in New York, to be sure, what about the rest of you? What about the three of you, 10th Ward, Atelier V, St. George? Can we find your absinthe and other fine products here in New York?
Yeah, so we distribute for all throughout the Mid-Atlantic, from New York down to Virginia. We're in about 6 states. We'll have to chat with this store that you guys are sitting in right now. But if you go to our website and you type in your zip code along with There's a drop-down menu where you can select the product that you're looking for. There's a product finder on our site, so you can find exactly what you're looking for and how close it is to you.
And the website is 10thwarddistilling.com?
Correct.
All right, very good. How about you, Jed?
If you go to the Atelier Vie site, that's ATELIERVIE.com, you can find our Where to Buy page. We're mainly focused on Louisiana and also Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. Now, we do have several stores in D.C., which will ship to quite a number of states. One of them is a site called Drinky, that's DRINQY, and another is Schneider's of Capitol Hill, which is seller.com.
Famous operation. Interesting loophole that D.C. has take care of the politicians about what they can do with alcohol coming in and out of D.C.
They need their alcohol.
There you go.
Oh, yes.
From all parts.
And Dave, do you have any idea what's going on at the marketing of the spirits that you produce technically?
But I've got ideas, I've got technical ideas, I've got all kinds of things. And DC is definitely the Wild West or the Wild East of spirits laws in general.
But I suppose we can find St. George's here in New York is what I'm just trying to suss out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our distributor in New York is Empire, and we're in about 42 major markets around the U.S., about 15 international markets, and our absinthe is very available in New York. And if you can't find it for some reason, please, we've got a spirits finder, a spirits locator on our website. We also have an email address we keep called findmebooze@stgeorgespirits.com. So if you're struggling on this at all for anything, you write to us, and I promise you a real human being is going to write back to you and try to help problem solve.
And Stephen,
The only U.S.-based absinthe that you'll see in most of your liquor stores, and many stores will carry maybe one absinthe. If they're a large store and they're really into the product, you might see 2, 3, maybe a little bit more than that. And then you'll see some of the big international or national competing brands that might have some of those artificial colors in them, for example, or flavors. So huge props to St. George for really getting it out there. I love seeing it on the shelf.
That's super kind of you, and I'm just excited to see this beautiful niche market because frankly, absinthe is it's a small niche market. That's really important, I think, for a craft distillery or a large distillery, simply because we're doing something like this. We're creating artwork. We're creating something that we care about. Absinthe is not the thing that is usually the base spirit in a cocktail. It's a rinse of a glass in a beautiful Sazerac. I will tell you that an absinthe colada is actually far better than it sounds, and it's cooling and refreshing in the hot summer months. But it's something that not everyone's going to go for. And I think that's part of the beauty of it. And I also want to say that I love that everyone had their own take tonight. None of it was purely based on some historical recipe. Everyone was trying to actually contribute to that and show something new, explore it, that's really exciting. That's not every group of distillers. So I just want to say thank you all.
And how about you, Steve? Where are your absinthe found?
So our distillery is we're big in some respects, quite a bit of whiskey and quite a bit of brandy, but we make very small amounts of liqueurs and absinthe, and we always will, especially the absinthe coming off, if you can imagine, guys, working with a 60-liter still. So we're 60-liter wooden still with a steam injector, right? So I'm making absinthe in a small scale and selling it mostly directly out of the distillery, which my wife and I built and we run. We're currently the only full-time employees in that winery and distillery. But we also sell out into about 60 or 70 stores in the Hudson Valley. And I want to give it a shout out to New York State for finally, after many years of lobbying, 2 weeks ago, the governor signed the bill that allows us to directly ship. So I can actually ship my absinthe to customers. It's quite exciting. So I'm looking forward to seeing if I can get behind in my absinthe sales.
So the governor actually did something right. A stop clock is correct twice a day.
Well, it took 3 years of lobbying, but we got it.
The one thing I would say about Steve's operation, having been there many times, Steve and I go way back, is that Stephen has resurrected a number of old turn-of-the-century Parisian liqueurs over the years, and it's a really amazing lineup of really crazy concoctions, but they're very cool. You looked them up in some library, and it's really fascinating. But anyway, loved the absinthe. I loved all of them. I thought they were really fascinating.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thanks to everybody. This was really illuminating. I wish we could devote another hour to this, but unfortunately we cannot.
No.
Sun is set, and there are other things to do on all of our ends. I really thank everyone for joining us here at Drinking on the Edge for this informative, fun, tasty session on absinthe.
Great job, guys.
Us.
Yes, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Enjoyed it. Beautiful.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed this.